last thing Jake Miller expected to find that October morning were barefoot human footprints around the abandoned barn. Footprints that appeared and disappeared in the damp earth, as if someone had walked only a few feet before, simply vanishing. Jake had bought the Whitmore farm 3 weeks earlier for a price that seemed too good to be true. Now he was starting to understand why. The property stretched across 40 acres of rolling land in rural Missouri, 2 hours from any town worth mentioning. The main house was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and windows that creaked even without wind. The faded red barn stood about 100 meters from the house, surrounded by rusted farming equipment the previous owner had left behind. Everything on the Whitmore farm felt frozen in time. The barbed wire fences were coated in reddish-brown rust, and weeds grew between the rotted boards of the porch. The artesian well still worked, but the water had a strange metallic taste that Jake couldn't quite identify. The closest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived nearly 2 miles away. When Jake had mentioned his purchase in town, Tom Henderson had simply shaken his head and muttered something about letting the dead rest. After that, the Hendersons rarely showed up again. The first few weeks were uneventful. Jake spent his days cleaning the house, fixing what he could and planning renovations. But small things began to bother him. Tools he left in the barn would be slightly out of place the next morning. Not much, just a few inches, as if someone had used them and then carefully put them back. Jake initially blamed his own distraction. Then the sounds began. Every night around 2 a.m., he would hear what sounded like the creak of a door. Always the same sequence: 3 slow creaks, a pause, then 3 more. Jake checked every door and window in the house, oiled all the hinges, but the sound persisted. In the 3rd week, while drinking coffee in the kitchen, Jake saw a woman walking through the field. She was wearing a long white dress and walked slowly between rows of dry corn that hadn't yet been harvested. Jake waved, thinking she might be a lost neighbor, but the woman didn't respond. When he stepped outside to speak to her, she was gone. It was on a Thursday that everything changed. Jake was in the barn organizing tools when he heard voices coming from inside the house. Multiple voices, speaking in low tones, as if holding a meeting. He stopped what he was doing and listened. The voices were clear, but he couldn't make out the words. Hurrying back to the house, Jake opened the front door. Silence. He checked every room, calling out, "Hello?" in a loud voice. Nothing. All the windows were shut, all the doors locked from the inside. He was alone in the house. That night, Jake decided to stay awake. He sat in the living room armchair with a cup of coffee and waited. At exactly 2 a.m., the creaking began. But this time, Jake realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from the barn. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was cold and moonless, and his breath formed little clouds in the air. As he approached the barn, the creaking stopped. Jake pushed the barn door open. It groaned loudly. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating hanging tools, bales of hay, and fresh barefoot prints in the dirt. He followed the prints with his flashlight. They led to the back of the barn, where a wooden ladder climbed up to the loft. Jake had never gone up there before. Heart pounding, he climbed the creaking steps. The loft was covered in dust and cobwebs, lit only by moonlight filtering through a small circular window. In the center of the loft stood an old rocking chair, and it was rocking, slowly, rhythmically, as if someone had just stood up. Jake froze, watching the chair move in silence. Then gradually the motion slowed and stopped completely. That's when he saw the photographs. Nailed to the wooden beams with rusted nails were dozens of black and white photographs. Men, women, and children in period clothing, all rigidly posed for the camera. But something was wrong with their faces. Their eyes had been scratched out with black ink in every photo. Jake stepped closer and recognized the house in the background of several photographs. It was his house, only decades younger. One photo showed an entire family standing on the front porch, a man with a mustache, a woman in a long dress, and 3 small children, all with their eyes blacked out. Then Jake heard the voices again. This time they were coming from below, Inside the barn, multiple people whispering urgently. He descended the stairs as quietly as possible and hid behind a bale of hay. The barn was empty, but the voices continued. Jake could hear them clearly now, though he still couldn't understand the words. They seemed to be discussing something important, something about the new man and making him leave. When Jake shifted to hear better, his foot knocked over an old can. The sound echoed through the barn, and instantly, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Jake felt as though dozens of invisible eyes were watching his every move. He held his breath, waiting. Then, slowly, the voices resumed. But now, there was something different in them. A tone of anger, of menace. And Jake realized with growing horror that he could understand some of the words. He doesn't belong here. He needs to go. He needs to leave, like the others. Jake ran back to the house, locked all the doors and windows, and spent the rest of the night awake with a kitchen knife in his hand. When the sun rose, everything looked normal again. Birds sang, the wind blew softly through the fields, and Jake almost managed to convince himself he had imagined it all. Until he found the envelope beneath his door. Inside was a single black and white photograph. It showed Jake sleeping in his bed the previous night. Someone had taken the picture from inside the room, right beside the bed. And like all the other photos in the barn loft, his eyes had been carefully scratched out with black ink. On the back of the photo, written in trembling handwriting, was a message. "You're next to leave. The Whitmore family never lets anyone stay." Jake packed his bags that morning and never returned to the farm. 3 weeks later, the property was up for sale again, at the same impossible-to-refuse price. And somewhere in the loft of the faded red barn, a rocking chair still moves on its own, while voices whisper about the next visitor who dares to disturb the eternal rest of the Whitmore family. Ethan had been driving for 4 hours straight when he saw the first rusted sign. Blackwood Farm Fresh Eggs, 2 miles ahead. What he didn't know was that the Blackwoods had vanished 3 years ago, and no one from the nearby town dared to drive down that road after sunset. His white van was packed with filming gear. Ethan was a freelance documentarian, always chasing the next untold story. And this one promised to be a good one. Abandoned farms in rural Kansas, families who had simply evaporated without a trace. The kind of mystery that drew views on YouTube, and maybe even a streaming contract. The Blackwood farm sat at the end of a dirt road that twisted through dead cornfields. It was October, and the dry stalks swayed in the cold wind, producing a constant rustling sound like crumpled paper. The property stretched for acres, surrounded by a barbed wire fence that had sagged in places, the posts tilted like crooked teeth. The main house was a 2-story structure, once white wood now peeling in large chunks to reveal a gray, weathered frame underneath. The 2nd-story windows were all boarded up, except one, the far right corner window, where a torn curtain fluttered in and out, as if the house was breathing. Beside the house stood a faded red barn, slumped against the leaden sky. Its main door hung ajar, creaking now and then with stronger gusts of wind. Ethan could only see darkness inside, a darkness so thick it looked solid. The silence was oppressive. Not even birds sang out here. Only the wind in the dead corn and the occasional groan of settling wood. Ethan parked the van near the front porch and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was even more deafening. He grabbed his camera and stepped out into the sharp chill of late afternoon. As he adjusted his gear, Ethan noticed something odd. On the porch floor there were footprints in the dust. Recent ones, work boots, large size, leading from the porch steps to the front door, which hung slightly ajar. That didn't make sense. The farm had been abandoned for 3 years. Who would be walking around here? Ethan stepped closer to the prints and crouched to film them. That's when he noticed something even more disturbing. The footprints only went one way, into the house. There were no marks leading out. He looked up at the 2nd-story window, the one without boards. For a split second, He thought he saw a silhouette move behind the torn curtain. He focused in, but there was nothing. Just the curtain, gently swaying. Must have been the wind, he muttered, but his voice sounded strange in the silence. Ethan decided to start filming outside, capturing the decay of the property. As he circled the house, he found more unsettling details. One of the ground floor windows was broken, but the shards of glass were scattered inside the house, as if something had broken in from the outside. Recently. In the backyard, he found an old well with the wooden cover partially open. As he leaned in to film, a sickening stench wafted up, sweet and rotten, like spoiled meat mixed with stagnant water. Ethan covered his nose with his sleeve and backed away quickly. It was nearly 5 p.m. when he decided to go inside. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden, eerie glow over the dead cornfields. He pushed open the front door, which groaned as it gave way. The inside of the Blackwood house was disturbingly well preserved, furniture still in place as if the family had just stepped out for a walk. Dirty dishes stacked in the kitchen sink. A 3-year-old newspaper lay open on the dining table, yellowed but readable. Ethan filmed everything methodically, narrating quietly to the camera. When he reached the foot of the staircase leading to the second floor, he heard the first noise. Thump. A dull sound, like something heavy falling upstairs. He froze and listened. Silence. Then another noise. A dragging sound, as if someone were moving a piece of furniture across the floor. "Is someone up there?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. The noise stopped immediately. Ethan climbed a few steps, the wood creaking under his feet. "Hey! If someone's here, I'm not the police, I'm just a documentarian." Total silence. He kept climbing, filming every step. The second floor hallway was narrow and dark, with 4 closed doors, and that one window at the end with a torn curtain. The light streaming in formed a dusty beam cutting through the gloom. Ethan approached the first door and tried the handle, locked. The second, also locked. The third door, however, was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly. The room was empty except for an unmade double bed. The covers were pulled to one side, as if someone had just gotten up. And on the pillow there was still the fresh imprint of a head. A fresh imprint. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Someone had definitely been in the house, or still was. He left the room and walked to the hallway window, the one with the torn curtain. He wanted to see if there was another vehicle he hadn't noticed. That's when he saw it. In the dead cornfield about 50 yards from the house stood a figure among the stalks. A tall man, dressed in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. He was completely still, facing the house. Facing Ethan. The documentarian instinctively raised his camera, but when he looked through the lens, the figure was gone. Ethan scanned the field with the camera zoom but found no trace. It was like the man had dissolved into thin air. Thump. The sound came from behind him. Ethan turned quickly and saw that the door to the bedroom he'd left open was now closed. His heart pounded. He stepped to the door and tried the handle. Locked. "Hey!" he shouted, banging on the wood. "Who's in there?" Silence. Ethan backed away, still filming. Then he heard a new sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from downstairs. Thump. 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 Someone was coming up the stairs. Ethan ran to the hallway window and looked down. His van was still parked where he'd left it. No other vehicles in sight. The footsteps kept coming, closer and closer to the top of the stairs. He was trapped. The other doors were locked and the only way out was the staircase, from where the footsteps were rising. He pressed himself against the wall, camera still rolling. The steps stopped at the top. Ethan could see a shadow stretching across the hallway floor, but whoever it was stood just out of sight around the corner. "Who are you?" Ethan whispered. "What do you want?" The shadow moved. Slowly, a figure stepped into the hallway. A tall, thin man in filthy work clothes and a dark straw hat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Ethan could see he was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile. The man walked toward Ethan, his footsteps echoing. With each step, the dim light revealed more of his features. Ethan then realized it wasn't a smile. It was something much worse. His mouth was torn open from ear to ear, a grotesque gash exposing rotted teeth and a dark tongue. His eyes were entirely black, empty holes in a decaying face. Ethan screamed and ran to the window. A 10-foot drop. No choice. He smashed the glass with his fist and jumped. Ethan landed hard, twisting his ankle. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He limped to his van, glancing back constantly. The second-story window was empty. No sign of the creature. He climbed into the van and started the engine with shaking hands. As he reversed out of the property, he looked one last time at the house. All the second-story windows were now open, and in each one, a silhouette stood, watching him leave. Ethan hit the gas and sped away. 3 days later, he was home in Denver, editing the footage. The quality was good, but something was off. In the hallway footage, as the creature approached, the camera had captured something Ethan hadn't seen in person. Behind the creature at the far end of the hall stood dozens of figures, all with the same carved smiles, the same hollow eyes, and all wearing clothes Ethan recognized from newspaper clippings. The Blackwoods, the entire family that had vanished 3 years before. Ethan never released the documentary. In fact, he never made another film. But sometimes, late at night, he swears he hears heavy footsteps climbing a staircase that doesn't exist in his apartment. And when he looks out the window, he occasionally sees a tall figure standing across the street, wearing a dark straw hat and smiling that impossible smile, waiting. There's an unwritten rule among the residents of Pedra Branca. Never accept a job at São Bento farm after nightfall. Marcus Henrique found out why the hard way. The 23-year-old had arrived in town at the beginning of October, fleeing the mountain of debt he'd accumulated in the capital. Pedra Branca was the kind of place where no one asked questions about your past, as long as you were willing to work hard. And Marcus was desperate enough to accept anything. São Bento farm stretched over more than 200 hectares across the hills north of town. During the day, it looked like any other rural property dedicated to cattle and corn. But there was something unsettling about the way the fields seemed to swallow the sunlight, casting long, distorted shadows even at noon. The farmhouse was a red brick building from the 1920s, with tall, narrow windows that looked like half-closed eyes. The paint on the exterior walls was peeling in large chunks, revealing dark stains that seemed to spread like open wounds. The red tile roof was covered in black moss, and several tiles had fallen off, leaving holes that allowed rain to pour inside freely. The cattle pens were about 100 meters from the main house, built from wood that had darkened over time to an almost black hue. The fences were crooked, and many boards hung loose, swinging with the constant wind that blew through the property. That wind carried a strange smell, a mix of damp earth, rotting hay, and something Marcus could never quite identify. What stood out most about the farm was the absolute silence that fell after sunset. Not even the crickets sang. It was as if all sound were sucked away by some invisible force, leaving only the wind rustling through the decaying structures. In his first week on the job, Marcus began to notice small things that bothered him. Joaquim, the foreman, always finished his tasks before 5 in the afternoon and left the property like something was chasing him. When Marcus asked about staying later to finish some repairs, the 60-year-old man looked at him with an expression that blended fear and pity. "Son, some things are best left alone. That farm has its quirks," Joaquim said, adjusting his worn hat. The Cardoso family who owned it before, well, they didn't sell it by choice. Marcus tried to get more information, but the foreman quickly changed the subject. What intrigued him most was the behavior of the cattle. During the day, the cows grazed normally, but they always avoided a specific area of the property, a small eucalyptus grove in the back of the farm. When Marcus tried to approach that spot, the animals grew visibly agitated, mooing and moving away. Dona Marta, the cook who came 3 times a week to prepare meals, also acted strangely. She always arrived at 9 in the morning and left strictly by 4, never a minute later. One afternoon, Marcus offered to help her carry some heavy pots to her car, but the woman refused with a vehemence that surprised him. "No need, dear, I can handle it. And you should be leaving soon, too. There's a time for everything in this life," she said, glancing nervously at the windows of the main house. The strangest behavior came from the farm's owner himself, Mr. Alberto. A man in his 70s, thin and always dressed in dark clothes, he rarely showed up on the property. When he did, he stayed only a few minutes, superficially checking the work and leaving without explanation. Marcus noticed that Alberto never looked directly at the main house. He always kept his eyes fixed on the ground or the distant horizon. It was on a rainy Thursday that Marcus decided to stay past the usual time. One of the corral fences had collapsed during the afternoon, and he wanted to finish the repairs before the cattle escaped. Joaquim had left at 5 as always, muttering something about not tempting fate. At 7 in the evening, with the rain pouring in heavy sheets, Marcus was hammering the last boards into place when he heard something that made him stop. It was a low sound, almost inaudible under the rain, a soft humming, like someone singing a sad melody. The sound came from the direction of the main house. Marcus lifted his head and looked through the curtain of rain. The windows of the house were dark, as they always were after nightfall. But something was different. One of the second-floor windows, which he was sure was always closed, was now slightly ajar. A white curtain swayed back and forth, fluttering in the wind. The humming stopped abruptly. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain. He dropped the hammer and slowly walked toward the house, stepping carefully through the muddy puddles forming in the yard. With each step, the silence seemed to deepen, as if even the rain were quieting. As he got closer to the house, he noticed the front door was slightly open. He was absolutely sure he had locked it that morning, as instructed by Joaquim. The wood creaked softly, shifting a few centimeters with the wind. Then he heard it again. Not the humming this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing on the wooden floor inside the house. The sound was clear and unmistakable. Someone was walking upstairs. Marcus froze, rain streaming down his face as he stared at the house in silence. His rational mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was Mr. Alberto paying a late visit, or some staff member he hadn't met. But something deep in his gut told him otherwise. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Marcus stood still for long minutes, watching the house, waiting for any movement. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and now he could clearly hear any noise coming from inside. Suddenly, all the windows of the house lit up simultaneously. It wasn't normal electric light. It was a flickering yellow glow, as if dozens of candles had been lit at once. The windows gleamed with a ghostly golden hue, casting an eerie contrast against the darkness of the rainy night. Marcus stepped back, his heart pounding. Through one of the ground floor windows, he saw a silhouette moving. It was human-shaped, but something was off. The arms were too long and the head moved strangely, as if it were too loose on the neck. The figure stopped in front of the window and turned toward Marcus. Even from a distance, through the rain-blurred glass, Marcus had the terrible impression that it was watching him. The silhouette stood motionless for several seconds, then slowly raised one hand and began to wave. A gesture that should have been friendly, but carried a malevolence that froze his blood. That's when he heard the voices. Not a single voice, but many. A chorus of whispers coming from all directions at once. Marcus couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of overlapping murmurs that made his head throb. The lights in the house began to flicker rapidly, creating a strobe effect that distorted the shadows around the property. Marcus saw more silhouettes in the windows, some downstairs, others upstairs. All moved in a disjointed way, like puppets controlled by an invisible hand. The front door opened fully. Marcus couldn't see who or what had opened it, but he could feel something coming out of the house. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now he could distinguish a single word being repeated over and over. Come, come, come. His legs began to move on their own. Marcus fought against the urge to walk toward the house, but it was as if his feet had a will of their own. Every step was a battle against an invisible force pulling him toward the glowing doorway. The voices became more seductive, promising things he couldn't understand but deeply desired. He was only 10 meters from the door when a loud, shrill sound pierced the night, the terrified bellow of a cow. The sound broke the trance. Marcus looked back and saw all the cattle stampeding toward the main gate of the farm, as if something were chasing them. That's when he realized he had walked farther than he thought. He was practically at the entrance to the house, one hand already reaching for the doorknob. He stumbled back, tripping in his haste to get away. The lights went out instantly, plunging the property back into darkness. The whispers stopped, as if sliced off by a blade, leaving only the sound of rain returning in full force. He ran to his car near the cattle pens without looking back once. His hands trembled so badly it took several tries to start the engine. When he finally succeeded, he slammed the accelerator and sped away from the farm, spraying mud and gravel behind him. The next morning, Marcus went to find Joaquim in town. He found the foreman having coffee at the corner bar and without hesitation, told him everything that had happened the night before. The older man listened in silence, shaking his head with a resigned expression. "I warned you, son. That farm's no place to be after dark," Joaquim said, stirring sugar into his coffee slowly. The Cardoso family lived there for 3 generations, until the day they were all found dead one September morning. Father, mother, 3 kids, and the grandmother, all sitting at the dinner table like they died in the middle of the meal. Marcus felt his stomach turn. What did the police say? They couldn't explain it. No signs of violence, no poison in the food, nothing. The doctor said it was simultaneous cardiac arrest, but he'd never seen anything like it. Joaquim took a sip of coffee and went on. After that, the place sat abandoned for 15 years. Mr. Alberto bought it 2 years ago, but, well, you've seen what he's like. He never stays there after sundown. Marcus never went back to São Bento farm. He found another job in a nearby town and tried to forget what had happened that rainy night. But sometimes, when he's alone at home and the wind rattles the window, he can still hear those whispers calling his name, inviting him back. And he knows that one day he might not be able to resist the call.